At 6:37 a.m. on October 25, 1944, the morning over the Philippine Sea was calm. The sky was just beginning to lighten, the water below smooth and gray, broken only by the slow wake of an American escort carrier moving east of Samar Island. For Ensign William Brooks, flying routine anti-submarine patrol, it was supposed to be another quiet flight, another uneventful sweep over what everyone believed was safe water. Then he saw something on the horizon that made his blood run cold. At first, it didn't make sense. Dark shapes, barely visible through the morning haze, rising and falling with the swell. Brooks blinked, leaned forward in his cockpit, and looked again. These weren't clouds. They weren't islands. They were ships. Big ships. As he drew closer, the shapes sharpened and a sickening realization took hold. Tall, tiered superstructures, pagoda masts, unmistakably Japanese, battleships, not one, not two, four, maybe more. Behind them, cruisers, destroyers, an entire surface fleet moving fast, cutting through the water at nearly 30 knots, a force that simply should not have been there. Brooks keyed his radio and reported what he was seeing. Japanese battleships, bearing down from the northwest, closing fast. On the carrier below, disbelief was immediate. There had to be a mistake. Japanese battleships couldn't be here. They weren't supposed to be here. North of Samar, the San Bernardino Strait was supposed to be guarded by Admiral Halsey's powerful Third Fleet, fast battleships, fleet carriers, the heavy hitters of the Pacific War. To the south, only hours earlier, American battleships had annihilated a Japanese force at Surigao Strait. Every assumption said this area was secure. Task Unit 77-4.3, known by its call sign, Taffy 3, was operating in what planners believed was a safe zone, 60 miles east of Samar, launching routine ground support missions, hunting submarines, protecting troops already ashore at Leyte. This was milk run duty. And now, out of the morning mist, the most powerful surface fleet Japan had assembled since Midway was bearing down on them. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force had slipped through the San Bernardino Strait under cover of darkness, undetected, unopposed. At 3 a.m, the strait had been empty. Halsey had taken the bait, racing north after a decoy force, leaving the back door wide open. Kurita could hardly believe his luck. Ahead of him lay the invasion beaches at Leyte. 130,000 American soldiers depended on naval gunfire and air support to survive. If Kurita reached them, the result would be catastrophic. Standing in his way was Taffy 3. 6 escort carriers, converted merchant hulls with wooden flight decks, built in shipyards that normally produced cargo ships, not warships. They could barely make 18 knots on a good day. They carried a single 5-inch gun each, meant for anti-aircraft defense, not surface combat. They were floating airfields, nothing more. Their aircraft, Wildcats and Avengers, were armed for ground support, rockets, small bombs, depth charges. There were only a handful of torpedoes among all 6 carriers combined. Their protection consisted of 3 destroyers and 4 destroyer escorts. The destroyers were fast but lightly armored. The destroyer escorts were smaller still, thin-skinned submarine hunters, derisively nicknamed tin cans by their own crews. Ships so lightly built that near misses from large shells could crumple hull plates from water pressure alone. The mathematics were brutal. The Japanese had guns that could hurl shells weighing over 3,000 pounds, more than 25 miles. The Americans had guns that fired 54-pound shells to less than half that distance. The Japanese fleet could outrun the escort carriers, outgun them, outrange them, destroy them at will. This was not a battle the Americans could win. And yet, as the first reports reached the bridges of Taffy 3's ships, there was no time to debate the numbers, no time to ask how this had happened. The pagoda masts were real. The enemy was closing fast, and within minutes, the horizon would erupt in flame. On the bridge of the escort carrier, Fanshawe Bay, Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague demanded confirmation. Japanese battleships could not be here. Every operational assumption said so. Admiral Halsey's Third Fleet was supposed to be guarding the northern approaches. To the south, American battleships had already destroyed a Japanese force in the night action at Surigao Strait. The enemy was supposed to be broken, scattered, retreating. Instead, Ensign Brooks's report was confirmed. Through the thinning mist, lookouts aboard the carriers could now see the shapes with their own eyes. Tall superstructures, massive hulls, shell splashes beginning to rise on the horizon. This was no raiding force. It was Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force, the most powerful surface fleet Japan had assembled since the Battle of Midway. 4 battleships led the formation: Yamato, Nagato, Kongo, Haruna. Behind them came 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers. More than 200,000 tons of warships advancing in line, built for one purpose: to smash through anything that stood in their way. At the head of the column steamed Yamato herself. 72,000 tons, the largest battleship ever built. Her main battery consisted of 9 18.1-inch guns, the largest naval artillery ever put to sea. Each shell weighed more than a small car. Each could be fired more than 25 miles. Against armored battleships, those shells were designed to punch through steel and detonate deep inside. Against the thin-skinned escort carriers ahead of her, a single hit could tear a ship in half. Kurita had expected resistance. He had expected American battleships blocking the San Bernardino Strait. He had expected a hard fight just to reach this point. Instead, the strait had been empty. Now, by dawn, he found himself staring at a group of ships he barely recognized: small carriers, short flight decks, no heavy armor, no battleship screen. For Kurita, it looked like an extraordinary stroke of fortune. For Taffy 3, it was the end of the world arriving at flank speed. The escort carriers were never meant to fight surface ships. They were designed to provide air cover for convoys and landings. Their wooden flight decks sat atop thin steel hulls with almost no armor protection. Their top speed, 18 knots, was barely enough to outrun a loaded tanker. If Kurita chose to pursue them directly, the carriers could not escape. Their aircraft were already airborne or being hurried onto the decks. Wildcats and Avengers launched as fast as crews could manage, many armed for ground support, not ship attack. Some carried rockets, some carried small bombs, some carried nothing useful at all. There were no reserves, no second line, no heavy units waiting beyond the horizon. The only thing standing between Kurita's battleships and the helpless invasion transports at Leyte were the destroyers. 3 fleet destroyers: Johnston, Hoel, and Heermann. Fast, aggressive ships, but lightly armored. Their protection was measured in fractions of an inch. Enough to stop splinters, not enough to stop battleship fire. And 4 destroyer escorts: Samuel B. Roberts, Dennis, John C. Butler, and Raymond, smaller still, built to hunt submarines, not to duel cruisers and battleships. Their crews joked grimly about their ships' thin hulls. One near miss from a large shell could crush plating inward like paper. The balance of power was not just unequal, it was obscene. Japanese gunners could engage from ranges where the American guns could not reply. Japanese ships could choose when and how to fight. The Americans could only react. As the range closed, Admiral Sprague issued the only orders that made sense: all ships to general quarters, all carriers to launch every aircraft that could fly, armed or not, and all escorts to make smoke. Black clouds began to billow across the water, laid down by destroyers racing back and forth at high speed. It was a thin, desperate curtain, but it was all they had. At 6:58 a.m., the northern horizon erupted. The first salvos were fired from Yamato's main battery. Towering columns of water exploded skyward as 18-inch shells slammed into the sea. The Japanese shells were marked with colored dye, red, yellow, green, so spotters could identify which ship had fired which salvo. To the men watching from the bridges of the escort carriers, it was terrifying and surreal. Brilliant geysers marching closer with every salvo. The sea itself seemed to rise up and attack them. Captain Dennis Sullivan of White Plains watched the colored splashes walk toward his ship. He ordered his helmsman to steer toward the last splash. It was an act of pure desperation, the belief that the enemy would not fire twice at the same spot. There was no doctrine for this situation, no manual, no training scenario. There was only the knowledge that if the Japanese fire became accurate, the carriers would not survive. As smoke, rain squalls and shell fire began to merge into a single wall of chaos, the ships of Taffy 3 ran and prepared to fight, because behind them lay the invasion beaches, and ahead of them lay battleships. As the first Japanese shells began to fall among the carriers, Admiral Sprague understood the truth immediately. The escort carriers could not outrun what was coming. Even at full speed, they were too slow, too lightly built, too exposed. Smoke might confuse the enemy for a few minutes. Rain squalls might buy a little more time. But time was all that mattered. Every minute the Japanese fleet spent firing at destroyers was a minute the carriers could flee eastward. Every shell aimed at a tin can was a shell not ripping through a flight deck packed with aircraft and fuel. Sprague issued the order that would define the battle. All escorts were to attack the enemy. On the bridge of the destroyer, USS Johnston, Commander Ernest Edwin Evans did not wait to hear more. Evans was 36 years old, a graduate of the Naval Academy, Cherokee and Creek by heritage. When he had taken command of Johnston, he had gathered his crew and told them plainly that this would be a fighting ship, that they would go into harm's way, that anyone who did not wish to do so should leave immediately. No one had. Now, without hesitation, Evans ordered flank speed and hard left rudder. Johnston turned out of the smoke and charged directly toward the Japanese fleet, 2,000 tons of steel racing at nearly 40 knots toward 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, and a wall of gunfire. It was not courage born of illusion. Evans knew exactly what he was facing. He also knew something else. If the Japanese had to deal with him, they were not dealing with the carriers. Johnston began laying smoke, thick and black, as her 5-inch guns opened fire at maximum range. The nearest Japanese ship was the heavy cruiser Kumano. At 14,000 yards, the American shells could not penetrate her armor, but they did not need to. They tore into her superstructure, smashed fire control equipment, killed exposed crews, disrupted her ability to fight. Evans drove his ship straight through falling shell splashes, zigzagging toward the enemy, closing the distance. At 10,000 yards, maximum torpedo range, Johnston launched all 10 of her torpedoes. Minutes later, explosions tore through Kumano's bow. Whether one torpedo struck or several, the effect was catastrophic. The cruiser sheared out of formation, crippled, her bow nearly torn away. Another heavy cruiser was forced to slow to cover her. In the opening moments of the fight, a single destroyer had removed 2 heavy cruisers from the battle. Then, the Japanese found Johnston. Secondary batteries from the battleship Yamato opened fire. 6-inch shells slammed into the destroyer almost simultaneously. One destroyed the after-engine room, another smashed a gun mount, a third exploded on the bridge. Commander Evans was badly wounded. His hand shattered, shrapnel tore into his body. Men around him were killed instantly. Evans stayed on the bridge. With engines damaged and speed reduced, Johnston fought on. More shells struck, 14-inch rounds from Congo, 8-inch shells from cruisers. The ship shook under the impacts. Power failed. Steering control was lost. Still, Johnston refused to withdraw. As Evans's ship struggled, other destroyers joined the charge. The order came over the radio, simple and unmistakable. "Small boys, attack!" USS Hoel accelerated to flank speed and drove straight toward the Japanese line. Shells began to straddle her almost immediately. Columns of water rose higher than her mast. She kept coming. At extreme range, Hoel launched her torpedoes at the battleship Congo. The Japanese ship turned away to avoid them, breaking formation. Hoel pressed closer, launching more torpedoes at heavy cruisers, forcing evasive maneuvers that disrupted Japanese gunfire. USS Herman raced through smoke and rain, weaving between American ships, emerging suddenly in front of the Japanese battle line. 4 battleships loomed ahead: Congo, Haruna, Nagato, and Yamato. Commander Amos Hathaway did not hesitate. He fired torpedoes at one battleship, then another, then aimed the last of his ship's torpedoes at Yamato herself. Lookouts aboard the Japanese flagship spotted the wakes. Kurita ordered Yamato to turn away. For 10 critical minutes, the largest battleship in the world, carrying the Japanese commander-in-chief, steamed north, away from the battle, evading torpedoes launched by a destroyer a fraction of her size. By the time Yamato turned back, the engagement had changed completely. Japanese formations were scattered. Gunfire was disorganized. Smoke and rain obscured targets. The American carriers were farther away. The destroyers were paying for every second with steel and blood. But they were buying exactly what Taffy 3 needed: time. As the destroyers tore into the Japanese line, the smallest ships of Taffy 3 prepared to do the unthinkable. The destroyer escorts had been built for one job: hunting submarines. They were slow compared to fleet destroyers, lightly armed and thin-skinned. No one had trained them for surface combat against cruisers and battleships. Now they were ordered to attack. On board USS Samuel B. Roberts, Lieutenant Commander Robert Copeland gathered his crew over the ship's intercom. He did not lie to them. He did not soften his words. The enemy force was overwhelming. Survival could not be expected, but they would go in anyway. The engines of Samuel B. Roberts were pushed beyond their limits. Designed for 24 knots, the ship shook and rattled as the engineers forced more speed out of her than she was ever meant to deliver. The deck plates vibrated. The hull groaned. She charged toward the Japanese heavy cruiser Chokai. At a range so close it defied belief, barely 4,000 yards, Samuel B. Roberts fired her torpedoes. Then she opened fire with her two 5-inch guns, hammering the cruiser's upper works. Shell after shell struck. Fire control equipment shattered. Crewmen were cut down on open decks. For a moment, it worked. Japanese shells roared back in reply. 8-inch rounds from cruisers, 14-inch shells from battleships further back. But at such close range, many of the Japanese guns could not depress far enough to hit the tiny destroyer escort. Shells screamed overhead or punched clean through without detonating. On the aftergun mount, gunner's mate 3rd Class Paul Henry Carr worked like a machine. Carr was 20 years old. His gun crew was firing at twice the designed rate. Each 54-pound shell was lifted by hand, rammed by hand, fired again and again. The gun grew so hot that rounds began to cook off from the heat. The air system that cleared the gun failed. Smoke choked the mount. Carr kept loading. The battle dissolved into chaos. Smoke screens drifted and shifted. Rain squalls rolled across the sea. Ships appeared and vanished at close range like ghosts. Japanese vessels maneuvered violently to avoid torpedoes and air attacks. American destroyers darted in and out of the smoke, firing until they were forced away by overwhelming fire. Above it all, American aircraft attacked without pause. Some had torpedoes, many did not. Avengers dropped small bombs, rockets, even depth charges. Wildcats strafed bridges and gun positions with machine gun fire, hoping to damage fire control systems. Pilots made repeated dry runs, diving at battleships without weapons, pulling up at the last second, forcing Japanese ships to turn and break formation again and again. One pilot would later land with more than 200 bullet holes in his aircraft. To the Japanese commanders watching this unfold, nothing made sense. The carriers they were engaging were reported as fleet carriers, massive ships that should have been protected by cruisers and battleships of their own. The destroyers were reported as cruisers. The aggression was relentless. The attacks pressed home again and again, regardless of losses. Admiral Kurita began to believe he had blundered into a much larger American force. Orders became confused. Coordination broke down. Individual divisions acted on their own. Destroyers were ordered away just when they should have been pressing torpedo attacks. Ships fired at shadows in smoke and rain. In the midst of this chaos, the cost mounted rapidly. USS Hoel, battered by shell fire from multiple ships, lost power. Her guns were knocked out one by one. She burned and flooded, surrounded by enemies on all sides. After nearly 40 minutes under fire, she rolled over and sank. Of her crew, only a fraction survived. Samuel B. Roberts continued to fight. Then 3 heavy shells struck in rapid succession. One tore a massive hole along the waterline. Another destroyed what remained of her engine power. The third struck the aftergun mount. The explosion was devastating. Most of Paul Carr's gun crew were killed instantly. Carr himself was torn open from neck to waist. He was mortally wounded. He had minutes to live. When a repair party reached him, he was still conscious. He was holding a shell against his ruined body, begging someone to help him load it, to fire one more round. Paul Carr died clutching that shell. By the time Samuel B. Roberts finally rolled over and sank, Her guns had fired more than 300 rounds, most of them by hand, most of them after power had been lost. A ship built to hunt submarines had fought a surface battle against cruisers and battleships and refused to stop. Around her, the sea was littered with smoke, fire, and wreckage. And still, the Japanese advance had not broken through. By late morning, the sea east of Samar had become a graveyard. Smoke hung low over the water. Oil slicks spread across the swells. Burning ships drifted, dead in the water, as survivors clung to wreckage and watched the battle continue without them. USS Johnston was still fighting. Crippled by repeated hits, she had fallen behind the carriers, her speed reduced to a crawl. Her hull was shattered. Fires burned unchecked. Most of her guns were silent, yet when Japanese destroyers closed in to finish her, Johnston answered. Her remaining gun fired again and again at point-blank range. Japanese shells tore through what was left of the ship. The deck was awash. Men were thrown into the sea by the force of explosions. Commander Ernest Evans was last seen on the fantail, still giving orders, still directing fire. He went down with his ship. Nearby, the escort carrier Gambier Bay could no longer keep up. Hit repeatedly by heavy cruiser fire, her engines lost power. She slowed, then stopped. Japanese shells tore through her flight deck, igniting aircraft and fuel. Smoke poured from her hangar. At 9:07 a.m., Gambier Bay rolled over and sank, the only American aircraft carrier sunk by surface gunfire in World War II. Her sacrifice bought the carriers behind her more time. Above them, American aircraft kept attacking. Pilots landed, refueled, rearmed with whatever could be found, and launched again. Some flew with no weapons at all. They dove anyway. They made attack runs anyway. Anything to keep the Japanese ships turning, firing, hesitating. From Kurita's flagship, the situation looked worse by the minute. Reports were contradictory. Heavy cruisers were damaged or disabled. Destroyers were low on fuel and torpedoes. Air attacks never stopped. Visibility was poor. Smoke and rain hid the enemy's true strength. Kurita believed he was fighting a powerful American carrier task force, not a handful of escort carriers. He had already lost the element of surprise. His formation was scattered. His ships were burning fuel at an alarming rate, and every minute he delayed increased the risk of running into Admiral Halsey's main fleet. At 9:11 a.m., Kurita made his decision. He ordered a general withdrawal to the north. One by one, the pagoda masts turned away. For the men of Taffy 3, it took minutes to accept what they were seeing. The enemy was retreating. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers, turning away from tin cans. Against every expectation, against every calculation, the Japanese fleet was breaking off the attack. The invasion at Leyte was saved. The price had been devastating. 2 destroyers sunk, 1 destroyer escort lost, hundreds of men dead or drifting in the water, ships reduced to twisted steel and flame. But the carriers still floated, and the Japanese had turned back. The battle off Samar was over. When the gunfire finally faded, the sea revealed what the battle had cost. Men floated in the water for hours, some for days. They clung to rafts, planks, empty life jackets. Oil burned their eyes, salt split their lips. Sharks circled beneath them, drawn by blood and wreckage. At night, the ocean turned cold and black, and the sounds of battle were replaced by cries, prayers, and silence. Some men tied themselves together so no one would drift away while sleeping. Others simply slipped under. Rescue came slowly. American ships returned when they could, carefully, wary of submarines and air attack. Many survivors were pulled from the water barely alive. Many more were never found. And even as the survivors struggled in the sea, the war continued. At 10:50 that morning, as Taffy 3 regrouped, a single Japanese aircraft broke through the defensive fire. It dove straight into the escort carrier St. Lo. It was the first organized kamikaze attack of the war. The aircraft slammed into the flight deck, detonating bombs and igniting fueled planes below. Explosions ripped through the carrier. Less than an hour later, St. Lo sank. The men of Taffy 3 had survived battleships. They would now face a different kind of enemy. In the days that followed, questions spread through both fleets. Why had the Japanese turned back? On paper, Kurita still had overwhelming force, Battleships remained afloat. Heavy cruisers were damaged but not destroyed. The American carriers were slow, lightly armed, and vulnerable. Yet, Kurita withdrew. Post-war interviews and Japanese records reveal the answer was not a single factor, but many. Kurita had lost control of the battle. His formation was scattered. Communications were confused. Air attacks never ceased. Smoke and rain hid the enemy's true size. Reports from his commanders insisted they were fighting fleet carriers, not escort carriers. Most of all, the aggression of the American defense made no sense. Destroyers charged battleships. Escort ships pressed attacks meant for cruisers. Aircraft dove again and again, even when they had no weapons left. It did not look like desperation. It looked like confidence. Kurita believed, incorrectly, that he had stumbled into the leading edge of a major American fleet, that Halsey's battleships and carriers were moments away. If he pressed on and was trapped, Japan's last operational surface fleet would be annihilated. So he chose caution. And that choice changed the war. Leyte remained secure. The invasion held. Japan would never again mount a serious surface challenge in the Pacific. For decades, the ships of Taffy III rested where they had fallen. Then, in the 21st century, they were found. Deep beneath the surface, more than 20,000 feet down, explorers located the wrecks of USS Johnston and USS Samuel B. Roberts. Perfectly preserved in the cold darkness, their guns still pointed outward, their hulls torn and scarred, frozen in the act of fighting. They had not turned away. Today, the names of those ships are carved into plaques and memorials. Medals were awarded, citations written, stories recorded as the survivors grew fewer with each passing year. But the true legacy of Samar is not found in documents. It lies in the moment when men aboard the smallest ships in the fleet looked at the most powerful battleships in the world and turned toward them. They were outgunned, outnumbered, and never meant to fight that battle. But they did. And because they did, an invasion survived, a war shifted, and history changed course, not through superior firepower, but through resolve. If this story felt worth remembering, it is because it was.